Welcome to everyone who is just now joining us. Thank you so much to this audience. We are so excited for today's conversation. For those of you who haven't had a chance to meet me yet, my name is Amelia Wald, and I am the Executive Director of the Virginia Club of New York. We are so thrilled to have you all here with us tonight. Just a couple housekeeping notes beforehand. You'll notice in the bottom of your screen, there is both a chat box and a Q&A box. We would love if you would use the chat box to share a little bit about yourself, about where you're calling in from, your class year. Feel free to include any comments on the panelist commentary in the chat box. And if you have some formal questions, you can go ahead and put that in the Q&A box in the right-hand corner. One of the fun features of our Q&A box is that you'll see a little thumbs up next to some of the questions, and you are welcome to put a thumbs up for someone else's question that you are really interested in. So this can cue to our moderators which questions are most of interest to our audience. So although this is a webinar, we do want this to feel very interactive and feel like you all are active participants in the conversation with us today. So if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A box at any point. And in the last 15 minutes, we will have some dedicated purely audience Q&A time after our moderated conversation. So with that, I would love to turn today's conversation over to Claire and Julia, who are the co-chairs of the Virginia Club of New York Studio Committee.
Hi, thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Amelia, for the introduction and for putting this on along with UVA clubs out of Charlottesville. I'm Claire Spooner. Julia and I are co-chairs of Studio, and we've been co-chairs for about 5 years here in New York City. One of the hidden silver linings of the pandemic is being able to put on virtual events like this. So we are not limited to having you all in New York City. So I think we have a lot of people from a lot of places. If you do find yourself in the city in the next several months or whenever it may be in the future, we will be having in-person events sometime soon. And we would love for you to join us. We do all of the arts affiliate types of fun events that New York has to offer. Matthew McClendon of the Fralin is now going to say a few words, and I'm going to pass it on to you. Thank you, Matthew.
Great, thank you, Claire. Greetings from Charlottesville. I'm Matthew McClendon, the J. Sanford Miller Family Director of the Fralin Museum of Art at UVA, and I am thrilled to be a part of my third arts panel. And very honored to welcome you tonight and introduce the moderator of tonight's discussion, Dr. Melanie Adams. The topic of the discussion tonight could not be more timely or important, and you could not hope for a better person to lead this conversation tonight than UVA alumna and museum director Melanie Adams. The Fralin was fortunate to have Melanie participate in a similar conversation earlier in the year in our ongoing virtual series, UVA Alumni and Museums in the Arts, which you can find the recording of on the Fralin's YouTube page. And I would encourage you to look for that after tonight's conversation, as well as the many other virtual offerings my brilliant colleagues at the Fralin have produced over the last year. And if you're in Charlottesville this fall, please do stop into the Fralin. We will be reopening to the public with exciting new exhibitions at the end of August. Now, Dr. Melanie Adams is the director of the Smithsonian's Anacostia Community Museum. With more than 25 years of community engagement experience in museums and higher education, she is dedicated to bringing stakeholders together to address relevant community issues. Previously, she served as Deputy Director for Learning Initiatives at the Minnesota Historical Society. Before that, she was the Managing Director of the Missouri Historical Society for 11 years. Melanie holds a doctorate from the University of Missouri, St. Louis in Educational Leadership and Policy Studies, a master's degree in education from the University of Vermont, and of course, most importantly for everyone tonight, a bachelor's degree in English and African American Studies from the University of Virginia. The Anacostia Museum has one of my favorite mission statements that I've ever read, and it is, together with local communities, the Anacostia Community Museum illuminates and amplifies our collective power. Founded in 1967 by the Smithsonian as an outreach effort to the local African American community. Throughout its storied history of over 50 years, the museum has remained relevant, developing documentation projects, exhibitions, and programs which speak to the concerns, issues, and triumphs of communities, and which tell the extraordinary stories of everyday people. Like all of you out there joining us tonight, I am so fortunate to now turn things over to Melanie and to listen and to learn from our remarkable panelists. Thank you, Melanie. You're on mute, Melanie.
Of course, I'm on mute. I was trying to be all professional, so that's the first snafu of the evening.
Somebody's got to do it at least once tonight.
Exactly. Well, thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And I am so happy to facilitate what I hope will be an engaging and interesting conversation. So as was mentioned, we'd love to see you put in the chat, your names, where you're calling in from, as well as your class year for UVA. That would be great. And then as we're having our discussion, please feel free to put comments in the chat and then more formal questions in the Q&A, and we will get to those. So what I thought I would do in a way to introduce our panelists, instead of me reading their wonderful bios, because they're all outstanding individuals, I wanted to start with a question to have them kind of answer the question and wrap that hopefully into their experiences. So I will start with Marina, and my question is, can you talk a little bit about your first experience with the arts? And I'm using that term very broadly. So the arts could be a concert, literature, museum visit, a play. Kind of, how do you remember your first experience interacting with the arts?
So hi everyone, I'm Marina. I'm so excited to be here. I'm actually in a museum right now. I'm in the offices of the MFA Boston, which is on the traditional territory of the Massachusetts and also Wampanoag people. So hi everyone, and please come to the MFA Boston. I'll be here a lot of the time, and I'm here installing a show. So I love that question, Melanie. I was thinking about it so much, and it's really hard to say. I think actually that my mom is on the Zoom. So this is kind of a little bit of all of the above. I think that probably my first arts experience I was thinking about in terms of like actual museum visits, because I work in a museum now, education. I think that children's books were a really, really important foundational early experience with art, and particularly Tar Beach by Faith Ringgold, which we had in our house. It's a fabulous book. I met Faith Ringgold like briefly about 7 years ago and was just floored to be able to say that I used to read that book with my mom. So really important, I think, children's books, and then drawing, and then having the opportunity as a young person to go to museums once my family moved from Guam to Washington, DC area. So free museums, really big, Smithsonian's, very important to my trajectory. So I think that that's a little bit of all over. So doing art, reading books with art, and then also going to institutions.
Great, Psyche.
Okay, great. Thank you all for having me this evening. My earliest introduction, I would say, came by way of my parents. Summers were non-traditional for us. Of course, we played and had fun, but every Tuesday, my mom used to sell World Book Encyclopedia. And so every Tuesday, it was Tuna Tuesday in our house. And, I grew up in the early 70s. I guess by then I was about 5 or 6. We would have to, my dad would have assigned each one of us an African country. And we would have to go through the encyclopedia and read and report out on the African country. So he could then tell us all the fallacies that exist in the World Book Encyclopedia. And so I grew up doing this. And also back then, we had, I was just telling my daughter this around Juneteenth, we had a series of comic books that would teach you about people like Crispus Attucks, who was the first African-American man to die in the Revolutionary War, right? and just the number of Black women writers and so forth. So that would be really one of my earliest experiences, going through the World Book and then also being exposed to those comic books. And then one of the really earliest performative based experiences I recall is actually celebrating Kwanzaa and Juneteenth. Buffalo, New York apparently has one of the longest standing celebrations. And I remember going down Georgia Avenue, I was just telling my sisters this last week, and we would have a full out celebration. And there was a trans woman named Georgette, and she would perform, and there was food and there was music and just all of that. And so I grew up with both that and Kwanzaa, you know, dressing because it was the 70s, Pan-Africanism was at its height. So those are my first experiences in the art engagement.
And I think, you know, why that's really important is I want us to really broaden that kind of definition of what we're calling the arts and culture. And I think, you know, as I think back to my own experience, again, I was born and raised in Northern Jersey, and I'm old enough to remember MLK was not always a holiday, but my mother would take us out of school. We'd go down to the Newark Museum. And back then they didn't do programs for kids. So we're sitting in these like boring lectures on MLK in our Sunday clothing. But that's what I remember being like my first experience around a museum. Okay. Really those types of holidays and events and things, much like you said with Juneteenth. Mm-hmm. So part of what we're discussing is these social movements that have happened over the last 2 years. And it's interesting as we put these in context, is that art has always been at the forefront of these. So it's not like all of a sudden art is trying to talk about what happened with George Floyd or with the Asian hate crimes. They've been doing that for centuries as we look back. So, but what do you think, I'd love to ask each of you, what do you think is different about this moment? Like, is there something that's going to make it, as I like to say, stick? Because it seems like it's cyclical. Mm-hmm. So do you have thoughts on what's different about now? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Psyche, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yes, I think you're absolutely right, of course, right? From the insurrections on slave ships. Right, where songs were a means of communicating, but of also unifying and building and performance and subterfuge, right? All the way through field songs, organizing, like the Colored Conventions Project highlights, right? There was music there, even it mentioned in the archives. Of course, what we know, what most folks know, is civil rights. That's their first engagement with the arts, if you will. But many of us also remember, as I just said, about the Black Power movement. And then some of us are also old enough to remember apartheid and the freedom movement, right? That was probably one of the most visual, along with the civil rights movement. And so I think what will help this current moment to stick is, quite frankly, social media. Nothing dies on the internet, really, right? And so we have a generation of folks who I think are much more in tune vis-a-vis Twitter, Snap, you know, even Finsta, whatever medium you are using, right? And those media are going to help keep this movement and the arts of this movement and the engagements of this movement, this current iteration of civil rights movement, really is what we're talking about, alive. Every day you see folks circulating different memes and images, and I don't think that that's likely to die down anytime soon.
Marina, what have you seen in your work at the museum, and how do you see this as beyond just a moment, but really a movement?
Well, I think that I'll just echo what Psyche was saying about the importance of social media in communication, spreading images, being able to create really responsive art. Because as you said, these arts and music have always responded to moments, but I think now the difference is how many people they can reach, how quickly. But I'd also say that I think that for people of my generation, the kind of veneer has been lifted, and we realize that it's not just going to, and especially I work in contemporary art, so kind of understanding that just having one artist have a show doesn't the museum change, right? That these are kind of bigger issues, bigger things that we need to address, that we need different kinds of people doing museum work to make different kinds of shows. We need lots of change at all levels. And I think that's something that we kind of have all come to understand and realize and appreciate, and want to see changes at every level, and not just think that this change is going to make the change stick. So I feel like it's almost a bit of a pessimism to continue the work and the change.
Right. And I think that's a really good point, because as I thought about it, I love the idea of social media as one of the reasons of the change. And one of the things I wanted to ask Psyche was, what type of change have you seen in your students? So as you're teaching students, like how are they different from students maybe 10 years ago around issues of social justice and action?
Right. That's a good question. You know, one of the things that can further a movement is popular culture, and that's what we're seeing, right? To echo what Marina has said, that wasn't there in 2000 or in 1999 when I started one of my first tenure track positions. It wasn't even there when I started in the community college in the 80s, right after I left UVA in 87. We didn't have those resources at our disposal. It would take weeks, sometimes to get information if it wasn't circulating in the news. And so we go from I remember this very clearly, talking with a student in Western Maryland and saying, one of the first assignments I had my students to do was to, you had to be aware of a current event every class, right? And we met Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And I remember getting pushback from one student who said, I don't need to do that. And I said, well, why? Why don't you think you need to do? He said, because I get my news from my grandfather. And I remember saying, have you thought through the number of filters it goes through before it gets, and of course he hadn't, he was first year student, he hadn't thought about that. But going from that and having experienced 9/11, I was teaching when that happened, right? And I remember going into the office and hearing something about a plane crash. That's just how vague it was. And then going back to my class and telling them, and then by noon or later on that day being like horrified, and then watching it replay over and over and seeing the mental anguish that my students engaged in, to now George Floyd, but even more closer to home, being closer to home at the University of Maryland, the death of Lieutenant Collins, and then certainly right after that, the death of Jordan McNair, who was a football player who didn't receive aid in a reasonable time and ended up succumbing to heat exhaustion or whatever medical issue it was. Lieutenant Collins was an African-American student from Bowie who was set to graduate and was stabbed by a young man who I had just met previously a couple of weeks earlier, and ended up being charged with a hate crime and so forth and so on. So my point simply is that the media and popular culture have really aided in the dissemination of this information, right? And the spreading of it so rapidly. And so, as Marina has said, in her generation, who is so in tune to this media, or these media, the information is moving at the speed of light, right? And so while it's beautiful, it's also very dangerous, because it's fast and it's quick, and sometimes it's overwhelming to process, which is why the arts component can help to take some of that edge off of the mental anguish that we see and experience on a day-to-day basis. You might just need to sing.
Right.
You might just need to dramatize. You might need to watch Black Mirror. You might need to watch, I don't know what you need to do. But even those shows can be a salve and a balm in some ways, because they take your mind off of it, but they also infuse some of these issues within. So it's another way of disseminating the information, and not just watching whatever news channel or wherever you get your news from.
And I think there's so much to talk about there, but I agree. It does provide you with a new and different perspective. And I think, Marina, one of the questions for you as a museum professional is, museums, we have not done the best job at this. So the narratives we created are not complete. So how do you see the museum culture responding to this moment? As we know, everyone put out statements. But have we seen museums backing up those statements with anything?
Yeah, I think across the board, the answer is probably no. But I think also as a museum worker and as the director of a museum, you know that these things, my colleague Leila Bermeo said it really well in like a different arts panel, that just because you don't see changes doesn't mean that people aren't trying to make change happen. I'm really lucky to be working on a project at the MFA that is kind of tangentially addressing the monument question. It's called Garden for Boston, and we've engaged a local Wampanoag artist named Elizabeth James Perry and a local African-American artist, Equa Holmes, to do gardens in front of the museum. They're just growing now, so it's not a ton to look at quite yet, but it's been really exciting to kind of think about basically their ideas, which came from kind of a conversation similar to this with the Arts of the Americas department about how can we change what the museum looks like, and what are other kinds of monuments that can happen, that can be there, that can grow. And I think sitting in this very old institution, working with contemporary artists, I think that a lot of what I can do in the programming that I put together, the exhibitions that I work on, is to really try to be responsive as much as possible and listen to people and kind of make space for people who can speak more directly to these issues, and really focus the kind of spotlight, the attention, and just let them be brilliant, and let the visitors and students who come to the institution kind of learn from that and think about engaging with the museum in different ways. Like, one of the texts that I read for this project was Alice Walker's From My Mother's Garden, because it really inspired the artist. And I love that now people walk up to the MFA and they see a short text, like a few sentences from a Massachusetts elder, and a quote from Alice Walker. And I think that it's really exciting. I think that what can happen is maybe shorter, more responsive things, but it really takes, the MFA right now has myself, who's Chamorro, I'm Pacific Islander, Indigenous. We have another Aquinnah Wampanoag curator. So we have 2 Indigenous curators, which most museums don't have. So I think that we're well placed and bringing in kind of more people from different backgrounds to be more responsive, to talk more about these issues. And I think that it's going to take a lot of work, but I think that we're all trying. And the alternative is not to have any diverse people at the table, which is a terrible idea to me.
Right. And so I'm going to encourage our participants to please put some questions in the Q&A section, because we will be getting to those. I did want to stay a little bit on the popular culture theme, because one of the things I really liked that you said was the diversity of the stories that are being told through popular culture. And again, as I remember in the 70s, if it was roots, like that's what I was going to see. I was going to see roots, or if I was going to see African Americans, it was going to be slavery. You weren't going to have stories that created a more fuller picture. I think we're not there with a lot of our communities. Unfortunately, I think some of our popular culture does still stereotype some of our communities. But I guess I feel like, especially as an academic, I guess we want people to be educated in whichever way they can, but there's also there's so much more than this to the story, and people will see something and think they understand, like Black Wall Street. And then all of a sudden they're like, we watched the show, we watched all 8 episodes, we get it. And you're like, do you know? So how do we work together with, I guess, pop culture? And this would have been a great question for our previous panel who wrote for Dear White People, but how do we really work with pop culture to make sure people are getting a broader picture?
Well, one of the things I wanted to piggyback on that Marina said that I think is so very important, and I was just having this conversation before I jumped on the panel. it's important for us not to take this as a moment.
No.
Right? I think it's easy to do that, but it's important for us to not do that. Black and brown people, BIPOC, whatever phrase you want to use, Asian Americans, we live in our identities every day. We don't live in a moment, right? And so to really do this work, to speak to what Marina is saying, it's ongoing. That's how you create systemic change. That's what critical race theory is all about. It's a tool for helping you to understand how to create systemic awareness and systemic change. That means it's ongoing. You don't watch one show and think you know the whole of the story. Just a couple of hours ago, we were passing in DC. My daughter and I were passing just before you get to NAMAC, the National Museum of African American Culture and History and Culture. I always get it backward. There's a placard that says "From Civil War to Civil Rights," and it had a picture of Abraham Lincoln and then a picture of the civil rights. And so my daughter was like, "Why is Abraham Lincoln on this picture?" Right? And I said, when you think Civil War, most people tend to associate him with, Abraham Lincoln with the Civil War. And so she was like, well, why? I said, well, let's look it up, right? So my point is, you cannot stop at watching one television show and think you have the whole of the conversation, right? So those things you're doing with gardening are wonderful and absolutely have to be done. But there are other conversations that tie into that will help folks unpack and dissect what is happening in gardening, right? In addition to Alice Walker, in addition to native and indigenous foods, there are also stereotypes that Black people live with every single day around eating and diet. This is a plug from my book, which will be coming out in the spring, right? Eating While Black, or food shaming and food policing in Black communities. And the point I'm making though is, but that's another layer, you see, right? But that's the work we have to do. We have to push the envelope to ask the question, okay, what else can we do with this one installation, right? And how does this tie to a television show like Roots? One of the chapters in the book looks at not only the first version of Roots, but the second version of Roots, which is very different in terms of presentation and in terms of what it opens our eyes to. And what we're really asking for, and what we're really talking about here, is recognizing that people are complex individuals, right? As Avery Gordon said, we have complex personhoods. That means we're not a moment.
Right.
We're not the George Floyd incident, okay? We're not just Tamir Rice. We're not just Sandra Bland. We're not just, Philandro Castile. We're not just Eric Gardner. We're not just these moments. This is our lives. Why do we have these things happening in our lives? Once we begin to be open to those dialogues, whether it's in the arts, in the museum, in our books, in our classrooms, whatever, then I think we open ourselves to being wholer, more whole beings who are able to have longer and more sustained conversations that enable all of us to thrive.
Yes. So you actually kind of jumped ahead of me, because I was going to ask about critical race theory, because I feel like it's in the news so much, we have to at least touch on it. But how do the current discussions around critical race theory impact the arts, if you think they do at all, and the work they do around issues of social justice? And again, I think even what Marina was saying, she was talking about one of the tenets of critical race theory in terms of counter storytelling. Yeah. So I always like to describe it as, we're all doing critical race theory work, we just don't call it that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Marina, yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And I really, love what Psyche was saying about just thinking about us as complex people. It's really kind of how I try to enter my work, is not just, I'm from an art history background. I have a lot of engagement with Native and Indigenous studies, which came from kind of ethnic studies, which is related to critical race theory. So they're all kind of camps/worlds that I live in. But I think what's important, and going back to the idea of popular culture and any exhibition, any work that I do, is I think of it as a start, not an end. And I want to encourage anyone who goes to a museum to kind of think about the work in that way. I think what's important is to say the real thing when you're writing a label, just like in any context, is just to kind of be there and be honest. And in the exhibition that I'm currently installing, since we're plugging things. It's called New Light Encounters and Connections, and it's pairing recent objects from my department, which is from 1955 to now, to the current moment, whatever current year that is, with kind of older collection objects. And there's a grouping that has a painting of, it's by Jalen Gomez, who used to go by Ramiro Gomez, a painter of two kind of day laborers, working men from Latinx backgrounds resting, paired with a painting by George Kalim Bingham, who's this American artist who painted squatters who kind of cleared the land. And that was a label that I really kind of intensely wanted to work through and wrote, because what westward expansion was indigenous removal, right? And there's not any other way we can say that. And so really connecting those things as kind of the benefits of rest, something that we're all thinking about during this moment where we're working more than ever somehow, even though our home is our work and it's not a great situation. But thinking about these different modes of rest and thinking about like, how can we actually say what this was, and kind of taking that approach throughout the gallery, because it's really important to kind of call out the different roots of something and to really be, upfront about the history of this country, which is so tied to the enslavement of African peoples and the removal of indigenous peoples. And these things go hand in hand. They're still affecting the world today in these big ways that we need to still address, and we need to remind everyone of that history.
Great. Psyche, did you want to add something about critical race theory?
Yeah, just really briefly, you're right. We've heard so much about it. And it's amazing to me because, I learned about critical race theory when I started graduate school in the 90s. So to hear this being played out, and quite frankly, I'm insulted that it's being dumbed down. Right. Because the minds of Kimberly Crenshaw, Mari Matsuda, and Derek Bell are phenomenal individually. So combined, and so many others who helped to author these dialogues around critical race theory, intersectionality. These are not terms that you can throw around, haphazardly, and folks come out with signs and say, no critical race theory. What is it?
Right.
As I say to my students every day, theory is a tool, but it's as dense on some level as accounting theory, economic theory, bell curve. But we know, just going back to what one of the Lisa S. said, she got criticized for having watched all 8 episodes of Black Wall Street. We know on social media, everybody is an expert until they're not, and so I think it's important to recognize that critical race theory is a tool through which we are using, it's a lens that we can understand the world. And when you understand the world, you get to what Marina is saying. Yes, this country was founded on the backs of Black peoples and the murders and displacement of indigenous peoples. It is a fact. Right. It's a fact. Now take that where you want to go with it, but you start there and you ask yourself why, and you ask yourself how, and you start to see the layers. Then you start to see, oh, there's a pattern here. That's what's being asked to be taught to children, how to think critically. Right. Who doesn't want their child to think critically about the world, right, as opposed to one-dimensionally, right? But we all know that in educational systems, if you don't fit this mold, this is how you have Black girls disappearing and Black girls who are seen and all of a sudden demonized as criminals, and Black boys and Native peoples who are cast onto reservations and forgotten about. This is and Asian peoples who are dying every day, and Latinas, and this is how you get peoples who are easily cast about without a care in the world, because we haven't thought critically about their humanity. We haven't thought critically about the ways in which this country, for all the benefits that we speak of, has also oppressed, suppressed, continues to repress people of color in multiple ways, in everyday ways. And that's what we're asking you to think about, so that you see our humanity, so that we can live in a more peaceful society. Who wouldn't want that? Right.
And I love that. I feel like that's exactly what the arts tries to do.
Absolutely.
To help people feel seen. And I feel like the diversity of voices that are now able to do that has really opened up over the past few years in terms of people not having to fit into a box or write a specific type of music. You can have African Americans who do country music, and that is fine. And so I think that really helps to open things up. But I'll start doing some questions because we have some meaty ones over here. So when incorporating Black Lives Matter or Stop Asian Hate themes or messaging into your art forms, have you ever received pushback from colleagues or friends? And then how do you navigate these conversations with people who may be ignorant to the realities of race in America? So those are two meaty questions. So the first one deals with how you incorporate Black Lives Matter or Stop Asian Hate themes into your art forms, and do you receive pushback? And then the second one is how do you navigate conversations with people who are ignorant around realities of race in America? So Marina, do you want to start with the first one in terms of your exhibits and work that you've done in museums and if you've gotten pushback?
Sure. I think that it's important to note that that while really important, those are also hashtags, right? So they're meant to live on a specific place, which is the internet. In the work that I try to do, I try to think more broadly than just the slogan. Not that that question was kind of setting up for that, but you know, what can we as museum professionals do to, I don't even want to use the word elevate, but like to focus on arts that we have not focused on, because I think that a lot of, as you said, like especially institutions that are based on kind of the mainstream art history, the mainstream art world, we have a lot of catching up to do. We have a lot of things that we have not seen, a lot of stories we haven't been able to tell because of the kind of collections that we have. So I think it's really important to not just think about, you know, having Native American art up during Native American Heritage Month, to think about Asian and Pacific Islander artists, not just during Asian and Pacific Islander Month, right? So I think probably what I do is really think about like, okay, like how can anything that I do reflect that I think there are lots of kinds of people who make exciting art. There are lots of histories that still need to be told. There are a lot of ways to respond to the current moment that aren't, for me, I think rebroadcasting someone's pain, and instead focusing on something positive, some stories that need to be told, or even just you know, art that's been made at the same time as oppression, as tragedy, as discrimination, that we can learn from, that we can kind of see. So luckily I'm not in PR, so I don't have to deal with the specifics of that, but I really just think about, okay, like how can me being here change something? What can I do? What can we show? And I kind of bring that into the projects that I haven't been working on. I also should say that I've only been at the museum since March 16th, 2020. And so there's usually a really big lag, right? So the things that you can do and bring into a museum often take, you know, years before you can see them on the wall. So I'm really happy that something that I've been worked on for years is up now, and you can kind of see that we value all those things, right?
Well, Psyche, do you want to
yeah, I just was going to jump in. I was just going to say really quickly, I mean, one of the easiest ways is to hire people of color who have expertise in these areas, right? There are lots of folks of color out there who do this work and who are trained to do work in material culture and museum studies. And so that might be one of the first ways that you can do this work. The second way that is less expensive is to tap into your communities, right? One of the beauties, as Melanie knows, of course, as the director of Anacostia, is the beauty of Anacostia being a community museum, right? In its founding. And then also, I recall many years ago, before they were dismantled, the National Museum of the National Museum of American History had 4 different exhibitions, one of each dedicated to a particular ethnic or racial group. So you have, for example, Field to Factory for African Americans, A More Perfect Union for Japanese Americans, and I forget the other 2 and their names. And so when those were like the signature exhibitions that were fought hard for by those communities to have representation, right, at American history. Ivan Karp did similar work at Natural History, right? Saying we have to move beyond showing African people as jungles and animals, right? That they are actual humans. So I say that to say one of the things you can do when you can't hire professionals is you go to your community and you ask your community to come in for a modicum of money or whatever you can do in kind, and you ask them to do the work that you are waiting for and I'm not saying this against you at all, Marina, at all, but you ask them to do the work while you're waiting for the actual assets to come on board, right? So for example, in College Park, we have Lakeland Community, which was an African-American displaced community by the university and others. That story is everywhere. Eminent domain, gentrification, it's everywhere. But bringing people from the community in to talk about their life experience in the absence, and they can bring the assets because they have them. They have the pictures. They have the material objects that they can use to tell the story of their lives. So there are multiple ways that we can have these ongoing conversations that do not require a great deal of time, but they certainly require building connections with our communities. And so as a museum professional, as a material culture specialist, as a specialist in race, class, material culture, this is what I encourage people to do. You talk to the people who surround your institution. Because if you can't hire that expertise, you certainly have it available to you in the life experiences and the stories that they have lived. So that's what I would suggest as one way of thinking about moving this conversation forward.
Well, and that actually ties into one of our questions, who asks about, in order to broaden narratives for communities of color, you really need more curators of color and directors and board members. So what strategies do you recommend to broaden recruitment and retention of people of color to influence the arts and beyond? So, I don't know, depending upon when you went to college, I remember my mother was just like, are you getting a job? Like, that was the key. I had to get a job. It wasn't are you going into the arts? So how are we getting more people of color into the arts to be able to break up this cycle?
Mm-hmm.
I think I have a lot of thoughts on this because I think it's really important. And I think that some institutions are incredibly successful, right, at recruiting people of color continuously, and some are not. And what are they doing differently? There has to be something that they're doing differently. And I think it's not like something magic. I think it's really just showing an engagement and having other people of color working there at different levels. And then you can kind of see this as a place that would welcome you, that would be amenable to your ideas. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position where I can make a lot of staffing choices. I wish I was, because I think that there's so much that needs to be done. What I find right now in my field of Indigenous arts is that I think this is true of other fields, there seem to be a lot of positions kind of just starting out and a lot of positions that are senior, and there's not much room in between. So I think that on the whole, COVID took a big hit on a lot of arts institutions. And I think that what needs to happen is more long-term positions. I think everyone could use more job security now. But I think it's really about kind of tapping into the networks and having your network of people and kind of constantly sharing between, whatever intersection of identity you identify. And then beyond that, like who could possibly be in this role that would make you or make your colleagues feel more comfortable. And then really thinking about needing senior staff at museums to be people of color, because then it really sets a great precedent, I think, for the rest of the institution, not because people of color are going to only serve interests of other people of color, but because it shows that this is a place where you can be promoted, you can move up if you're not someone who, I'm in Boston, if you didn't go to Harvard for all of your degrees, right? That this is an option. If you don't come from like an old network, this is an option that's still open to you.
Great. Psyche, did you have any thoughts on that? as you see students and them making their career choices probably daily?
I mean, we encourage our students to think along a broad swath of careers, from nonprofits to museum work to teaching in the academy, teaching at the K-12 level. You know, we have a number of our students, for example, who are in private and public schools, using their degrees in the work that they have undertaken in American Studies at Maryland. So I agree with Marina 100% in that what I would like to see, though, is more engagement, as I said, between communities and our community institutions. We are sitting on a rapidly declining gold mine every time a generation of elders passes away. COVID did a huge number, as we know, on communities of color. And so with that went living archives. But we also know that most of the time people are their own living archives, right? And as I said, they have those materials in their homes. And we encourage our students to learn community engaged scholarship. You know, how do you build relationships in communities? Because really that's where the foundations of our knowledge is coming from, right? We're taught theory all the way through graduate school to apply to the very lives of people. At least we do in American studies. And so that's really what's at the crux of the training that we give. That's across the board, regardless of where you want to see yourself in years to come. It's how do you engage and value people? That's the nature of humanistic research.
So how do we look at disrupting these systems? Like, I know, Marina, you said, oh, well, I'm not in a position to make decisions, but, you know, I always think of that leading from the middle. Like, there are a lot of decisions and things that you probably could make that you're not giving yourself credit for. So how, you know, just that the mere fact of the exhibit that you're doing. So what are some ways that we can disrupt these systems? So they're created, these art systems are created as spaces that are more equitable.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I wasn't trying to discount it. I actually can't hire anyone, but yes, I think, you know, we are all in various positions of privilege, and I use mine as much as I can to, you know, further things that I think are important. I would say that what I think is what, just to echo Psyche, is paying people is so important, and opportunities to pay people. I think that engaging with our community, you know, it's important to hire and it's important to engage. It's important to do both. But I think that valuing people in any way, valuing people through paying them is the best way to show that you value them. So I think when I'm doing like programs, when I'm thinking about things for the museum, that's kind of always like where I start is like, you know, even if someone's gonna talk for 10 minutes, their time is really valuable. They're not giving me 10 minutes, they're giving me an hour. And I want to, you know, always make sure that we value people's time in that way. And so I think that there's a kind of balance that I'm trying to strike between really reaching out, doing as much outreach as possible, and always being in a position to be able to offer something back. Because I think just a platform at this stage is not enough. From the community groups that I've engaged with, from the artists that I've engaged with, we get so much out of it. Our audiences get so much out of it. And so there needs to be, you know, just some give back, even if it's just kind of something small. So I'm not sure if that answered your question.
That was good. So I would encourage people, we might have time for one or two more questions if you want to ask them in the Q&A. I guess one of my questions was, do we, as the role of creators of culture and programs and things, do you feel that our audiences are expecting something more from the arts than pure entertainment now? So it's not only you want to go in and laugh or you want to just forget what's happening, but are people expecting more from their arts experience?
I mean, I'll jump in and say, I think that's a great question. I would argue that the average person doesn't know what an arts experience is.
Oh, okay.
And so in my experiences, speaking at libraries and community centers, in the hinterlands of America where there were 2 people, 5 people, 10 people, hundreds of people. One of the things that I find that people value is their experience. So I don't disagree with Marina, but I disagree a little bit with Marina in the sense that here's what I found in my many decades of doing this work. When I've invited a community person into my classroom and I said, bring something that tells me about your experience. Certainly being at the University of Maryland, I have access to a few resources for sure, but most often what I find is they want the audience, they want the stage, they want to be able to share their experience. And so even before, any honorarium goes out, because that takes months sometimes to get, through the bureaucracy, the engagement that they have with the students, they love it. The engagement they have with the audience to be able to say, this was a domestic uniform that was used. And let me tell you about that. And then to actually see and hear that. And I remember when Spencer Crew, who was, when he curated Field to Factory, was a Bill Yanks, I think, and they were talking about having gone and found a domestic uniform. And they were so excited. And then they went back later, and I hope I'm telling this story correctly, and the folks wanted to charge them for it. But I'm always struck at that initial encounter where the person was willing to give it to the museum until they realized it was of value. One of the things that we have the most value of is our voice and our experience. And so whether you can, and I'm not here now talking about artists, I'm talking about the everyday artist who doesn't know they're an artist, in conversation maybe with the artist, the actual artist. And so I just keep coming back to the lived experience because we are in a moment that we cannot lose. And I think it's easy to do that by focusing up here. I'm with Melanie. Think about where you can disrupt, right? I think about Fred Wilson's Minding the Museum and how he did disrupt at the Maryland Historical Society by taking 2 objects that you never would imagine, a pacifier and a Ku Klux Klan robe, and put the 2 together to be in conversation. Okay, that might require expertise, but it requires nothing to ask community folks, or I don't want to say it doesn't require anything, but it requires finesse to ask community people from here and here, bring the same object and have a conversation about what it means in the indigenous community, what it means in the Black community, what does it mean in the Hmong community, what does it mean in the Portuguese community, or what does it mean in the Guatemalan community? The same object. You have a phenomenal program, to my way of thinking. And I think that's part of the arts that we miss. We're here when the average person just wants engagement with their life experience. That's my experience, at least. And when I teach folks and I hear our students and I travel and I talk to people, they just want to be heard. And they want you to hear them. Mm-hmm.
And that's such a good point. And Marina, you were talking a little bit about this earlier in terms of what museums used to be. And I think so many times now museums are becoming more of that community-based model. And again, Anacostia, that's how we were founded, back in 1967, really was that community-based model. And so when people talk to us about collecting, I may say, like, I don't need an iron, but is there a good story behind the iron? Like, it's about the story that the artifact tells. Because it's a community-based museum, I'm not trying to collect Dorothy's slippers or Abraham Lincoln's hat. I need the stories of everyday people. And those stories are told through the artifacts that they give to us. But Marina, I did love what you said about paying people, because I think that is one of the biggest challenges right now. And someone mentions that in the chat about museums not paying for interns. And that then very limits the students who can participate and even see museum work as a field, because they can't work for free, and no one should be working for free. So how do we look at providing resources? And I always like to say, your budget is a moral document. So it drives me crazy when people say we have to raise money for internships. And I'm like, or you could just rearrange your budget if it's a priority. So you shouldn't have to, you should be able to find the money to do that. So we only have a couple more minutes. So I wanted to give each panelist an opportunity for kind of a closing statement of You know, what do you hope for the future? What do you hope a year from now we'll be talking about in the arts? So assume everything will be back to whatever normal looks like. But what do you hope the arts looks like? And what do you hope we really took from this moment?
So I just want to push back a little, Psyche, and just say that I was meaning to pay people for their time in a public facing way.
Oh, yeah.
There's about, 1,000 emails and phone conversations before you get someone to that stage. So completely agree. And also just really want to, again, acknowledge the place I'm coming from, which is tied to the MFA, a museum that's been, kind of a jewel box of Boston since 1870. So that's very different than, if I'm taught a few times and reaching out to an artist that I know. And that's a very different form of engagement. But if I'm coming to someone like as the MFA, I have to acknowledge that and really think about what that place is. Even if, I say I don't get staffing decisions, like I still come with the institution. I'm still like approaching people from that space. But I think that that's such a great question, especially thinking that the kind of conclusion that we've come to is that we're hoping this isn't a moment. We're hoping this is the start of a shift. Psyche, did you want to answer that first, or?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think that part of the shift, yes, absolutely. I believe you need to pay people. You're going to pay me for my time and my expertise. Absolutely, absolutely. But as we move forward, I think to Melanie's point about the moral document, and that's part of the systemic change. Yeah. You showed that you are committed to moving this beyond a moment by making some changes in your budget. Maybe you don't prioritize the large assets. Maybe you prioritize the everyday life. That's a systemic shift, right? And I'm gonna leave that part right there. And so what I would say is, as we move forward and our eyes have been opened, we know the power of a video taken by a child with a camera on a phone. That's everyday life. That's not up here, but it has the impact to reverberate throughout the world, clearly. And so I'm encouraging us to think about the ways in which we use not only the budget as a moral document, which was spot on, but also how we rethink changing systems. That's where it starts, I think. How do we shift the system? How do we shake the table? Right? How do we want to say hold place? What does that mean if you're not holding place by giving room to the everyday, which is where most of us live in the meantime? The majority of us don't live out in these stratospheric kinds of happenings. We live in the everyday. And so what can you do to have a conversation about arts and police violence? What can you do to have a conversation about arts and food policing of particular communities? How do you demonstrate that? Those can be conversations. You can show a movie clip or what have you. You can bring in popular culture to break it down and then build it up. I'm simply saying we need more dialogue, right? And I'm hoping that as we dwell in the everyday and in the meantime spaces, that we will continue to see museums and libraries and other venues, bookstores, and so forth, as spaces that we can hold space by having simple conversations about our everyday lives and the similarities, and appreciating the vast differences that often surround them.
Great. Well, I think that's a great place for us to close here at 7 o'clock. And I wanted to just thank both of our panelists, obviously, and then also let people know this is just the beginning of a conversation. So we barely scratched the surface on a lot of our topics. So hopefully this has given you something to think about, something to talk about, and hopefully you enjoyed it. So I will turn it back over to Amelia.
Thank you all so much for this conversation. It was incredibly insightful and engaging, and we are very grateful that you shared your time and your perspective with us. So I want to say a huge thank you on behalf of the Virginia Club of New York, of the UVA alumni, both in New York City and beyond. And so thank you to all of our audience members as well for your very intriguing questions and being active participants in this compelling conversation. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Have a great rest of your week, and thanks so much.